Welcome to another fantastic episode of Into the Metaverse. Joining us today for episode 12 of season 2 is an epic guest, the man who helped popularize the term Web 2.0 in the aftermath of the dotcom crash, Tim O'Reilly. Tim has a history of convening conversations that reshaped the computer industry. He's played a key role in framing and evangelizing terms such as open source software, Web 2.0, the maker movement, and government as a platform, among others. He's the founder, CEO, and chairman of O'Reilly Media and a partner at early stage venture firm O'Reilly AlphaTech Ventures. In addition, Tim is a board member of Code for America, Peer.J, Civis Analytics, and PopVox. His book, W2F, What's the Future and Why It's Up to Us, explores what technology advances teach us about the future economy and government as its platform. He is a visiting professor of practice at University College London's Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose, where he's researching a new approach to regulating big technology platforms by limiting their ability to extract economic rents. So many things that are relevant to your conversation. Welcome, Tim. So great to have you with us today.
I'm glad to be here. Good to see you. Thanks.
Okay, so Tim, diving right into it, we always like to start the conversation with all of our guests on the podcast in the same place as we continue to build a consensus around what the metaverse is and what the metaverse is not. And so in your mind, with your approach, your point of view, how do you think about what the metaverse is? What is your definition for it? And alongside that, what do you believe the metaverse is not?
Yeah, well, I think the very first thing I like to do is start with, well, what's the framing metaphor that we use for the metaverse? And if you think about it's the antecedent in terms of virtual reality, you think of Second Life. And a lot of people conceived of it as a place, and they're starting to do that with conversations about the metaverse as well. With the idea that somehow you've got to acquire real estate, there'll be a site that people visit. And I think it's much more important to frame it with two central ideas. And the first one is that the metaverse is a place where people meet. Actually, Zoom is a better antecedent for the metaverse than Second Life is. Twitch is a better antecedent for the metaverse than Second Life is. And so, for that matter, email is a better antecedent for the metaverse. The metaverse is where we connect with other people online, and it's really a continuum in the way that we have increased our ability to share and communicate with higher fidelity. This idea was planted actually by Craig Maud, who's a wonderful technology observer. He lives in a small town in Japan, does a lot of walking in the old trails of Japan, photographing vanishing Japan. He's a designer. But he wrote this post, and what he said was, I already live in the metaverse. In my everyday life, I live in a small town in Japan. I interact with locals, and in my work life, I interact with people all over the world. And he does that, through writing, through video, through live conversations. He has a Substack newsletter, various kinds of ways that he's communicating. And I thought about that, and I said, he's totally right. And then if you and again, how I think about not just the metaverse, but technology in general, is it proceeds in a direction and at a rate, which is really a vector, right? And you can think of emerging trends, the sum of various vectors. And certainly one of the vectors that has gotten a lot of attention is the growing richness and capabilities of virtual reality. But I think that's not the most important one, because again, because of this continuum concept. And what's really interesting, if you look at the vector that goes through our initial internet communications, which was text only, and then we got to video, and video was originally something that was high production values, and then it became more and more, short form. You think the evolution through YouTube to TikTok and other TikTok wannabes. You think about gaming as another vector that's converging into this space. Originally on arcades, very solitary activity, but increasingly you saw these social games, things like World of Warcraft. But now, I just watched my grandson just even playing Minecraft, and it's with friends. And, you can't go to sleep in the next room because they're excitedly jabbering away over an audio channel while they're playing in a shared space. And so there's gaming. Now think about where Zoom is going. It started out, telepresence was incredibly expensive. Very stilted. Used to buy these, video conferencing systems for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And now it's something, particularly with the pandemic, that everybody has. There's all kinds of competing platforms, and it's getting richer and richer. You look at something like which is this startup from Phil Lieben, founder of Evernote. And, allows you, basically with a bunch of simple effects to put yourself into your presentation. And there's this vivid video that he shows on the site where he's got this, he's talking about the pyramid of communication or whatever. And suddenly there he is in the top of the pyramid talking out of it. And there's all this creative work with backgrounds and integration of what you're presenting with who you are. And you go, oh, that's so clearly on the vector towards the metaverse, and you go, oh yeah, it's about richer and richer communication. That doesn't mean that there won't be some set of places, but I think, companies that are thinking about the metaverse as somehow the next generation of the web, probably not. The rich immersive place-based metaphor. It's expensive, right now to produce something, or it's either expensive or cartoonish, And I think when I think about the interesting future of virtual reality, it is going to be blended. I think it's not going to be very avatar heavy, at least not till avatar has become indistinguishable from humans. So if you think about superhuman fitness, which Facebook touts quite a lot, what's really interesting is the way that they have integrated real world imagery with with gameplay. So the one I was trying was this boxing training, and they have a fitness instructor who leads you through the warm-up. So it's a lot like a Peloton fitness video, right? There's an instructor there, except they were clearly videoed on green screen. Again, Peloton obviously has a live component, but I do a lot of Peloton strength training workouts with a friend, and it's kind of interesting. This gives you a real sense of the metaverse. She has the Peloton subscription. She plays the recorded videos over Zoom to me and my wife, and the three of us exercise together in this, effectively the shared space of Zoom. And it's an evanescent space, but it's just like, hey, we have a rendezvous at 7:30 in the morning on weekdays, and not to mention my wife is also in a 7-minute workout group with women all over the country. They get together at a set time, and it's mostly just a Zoom where they're talking, and then they play a recorded 7-minute workout soundtrack. So it's just audio that they've added in, and they're exercising together. So that's metaverse. So you kind of see all of these things converging, but it's all about people coming together in generally an ad hoc space. And so again, when I think about companies that are trying to do their metaverse strategy, and they're trying to build out a storefront or a venue. That's such a small part of the possibility space. And as I said, I think that for me, thinking of it, what's the next generation of Zoom is much more productive than thinking, some of these things that you see Facebook peddling, where there's this badly drawn avatar of Mark Zuckerberg hanging out with a bunch of other badly drawn avatars. I just don't think that's the future.
And what's concerning and also entertaining about what you just described with Meta and what they're showing with the avatars is that, not to disrespect the phenomenal people who are working on those things, of course, at Meta, but it is so unimpressive that it might give a wrong impression to the rest of the world of what are the possibilities and what are the things that can create in bringing people together. I think you're touching upon on a bunch of things, and I know Matthew is probably going to want to dig in on the Web3 quote unquote blockchain piece in a sec. But before that, do you think that as you talk about Metaverse as a place people come together and they generally come together at an ad hoc place, do you believe that that necessarily has to be in a 3D modality, or do you think it's going to continue and be 2D, 3D?
That's right. I believe that we are doing this podcast in the Metaverse right now. There are three of us in different locations, and we are in this temporarily shared space, which has basically, your view of me, my view of the two of you, each of you in a different space. And that's the thing. Back when I wrote about Web 2.0, and I was talking about the internet as a platform, and I was actually contrasting that with the old model, where I talked about like Netscape was trying to compete with Microsoft, with the idea that the web was a software thing, right? They had the wrong metaphor. It's like, we're going to own the web top, they called it, right? And but they were kind of recreating the old metaphor. And then I contrasted that with Google, and I said, look, the network doesn't exist in one place. It exists between. The internet is between places, and Google is a creature of the between. Any interaction with Google, is bringing in advertisers from one place, is bringing in content from another place. The user is coming from this place, and it's all converging dynamically, ad hoc, on the fly, right? And again, if you think about, well, where are we now? Right now, we're in this ad hoc shared space with three separate network streams from three locations. And, the location it's as if really we're in this room, these three adjoining rooms, right? Connected by this in between. And that is, in fact, the metaverse. And then the question is just, how does it become richer? And that's why I mentioned as a good example of somebody who's working to make it richer. And I don't think that the 3D, well, again, going back to Supernatural, I think, Zoom backdrops is kind of like a step in the right direction. I do think that it with a good headset, it can be very immersive, like that, boxing game or training that I was doing at Supernatural Fitness. It opens, you're on the edge of a volcano, really photorealistic. You're kind of, there is that wonderful immersive experience with a good headset. It's pretty cool. And do I think that one day there will be a time when those headsets become so cheap, so lightweight, maybe they're projecting onto your eyeball, whatever it is, that will really have that kind of immersive thing? Yeah, maybe. And right now, it's a part of the metaverse. So anyway, here I'm standing on the lip of this volcano, with this game, which is these totally virtual things coming at me over the edge of the volcano. And depending on their shape and direction, I have to do, this is a hook, this is an uppercut, and whatever. And it's sort of like training you with this totally, very clearly fake virtual thing overlaid with this thing, which seems very real. And by the way, this volcano, I had no idea such a place existed. It's a volcano in Ethiopia, and if I were trying to cast Mount Doom in Lord of the Rings, that was the place. Like you're standing on the place where Frodo and Gollum wrestled over the ring at the end, you know.
Well, I know what I'm going to try out after the recording. So
Yeah. Anyway, but the point is, yeah, it's really cool. But even there, you know, you kind of think about it, it's basically just a 3D rendering of a single space. And I think what's going to get really interesting is with the addition of AI. When you can, you know, there's this concept in gaming of NPCs, non-player characters. And there's this very interesting game that my wife's ex-husband created called Spy Party. And it's actually kind of a reverse Turing test because it's a game populated with NPCs, non-player characters, you know, i.e., you know, generated by AI. It's a cocktail party, and your job is to figure out who the human player is. You know, the other human player. You know, in this cocktail party of NPCs, and it's pretty interesting because I think we're going to get to a point which we're seeing with some of the conversational large language models, where the bots are going to be able to fool us most of the time, and you also can get to the point where they're going to be able to do, you know, the equivalent of deep fakes, where you actually have you know, generated characters that don't look like fake avatars, they look like real people. And that's going to be really interesting. It's still a few years out, but
this is something we talked with, you know, in a previous episode with Professor Udi Shapiro, who is doing a bit of that research of the Sybil problem and how do we make sure that it's actually a human you're interacting with. And this is a long conversation, and I think there could be a follow-up here on this topic alone, Tim. But I want to switch a bit gears and, you know, hand over to Matthew to talk a bit about the Web3 component and get your point of view on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And just before I shift gears, I just wanted to kind of circle back and put it together. I thought what you said about, at its heart, the metaverse is a social movement. And that's something that both Yon and I are very, you know, passionate about, that this is about connecting people and connecting places. And I think that gets lost in the VR headsets and the blobby Mark Zuckerberg. And we have to step back and just remember that, you know, human interaction is what's driving this. And I think that's really important.
Absolutely.
And so moving on to Web3, as Yon said, you know, since you were so instrumental in helping to popularize the term Web 2.0, we have the chorus of Web 3.0 proponents and how those technologies intersect with the development of the metaverse. Just broadly, how do you think about Web 3, all these technologies, crypto, blockchain, NFTs, et cetera? And then how does that impact what your view of the metaverse is that you just described?
I think, well, first of all, there's several versions of Web 3. You know, there's the original idea of we want to build this new decentralized set of protocols that will allow, you know, kind of a restart in some sense of the current web and all the way it went wrong. And there was an idealistic component, and then that got overlaid with a bubble-fueled financial component. And clearly, it's very hard to tell right now what's real in it. And that's why when I first started, you know, people started calling me up and asking me, "You're the Web 2 guy, what do you think of Web 3?" And I said, look, we called Web 2 after the bubble burst as a way of drawing attention to why did certain companies survive and other ones, you know, perish in the dot-com bust, and trying to use that to tease out the principles. And so what I really said was, look, what I would be thinking about is what's going to be left after the bubble bursts. And, you know, and it's pretty clear to me, for example, things like Bored Apes, there's not really value being created there. It was purely a speculative financial asset being, you know, bought with other speculative financial assets, various coins. And, you know, there are some, you know, like, so I said, you got to go look for what's really happening, you know, and the research is pretty hard to find. You know, it was a lot easier in the early days of the web to watch the actual adoption, but there's a lot of obfuscation. You know, people talking about, well, there's this many, you know, cryptocurrency transactions, but a lot of those transactions are just overhead on the system. and they're not. They make it sound, like they'll say, "Oh, we have more transactions, than we're up to a quarter of Visa or some number like that." And I go, "But they're not the same thing, And so I think that there's a lot of noise in the system, and it's just very hard to tell what's real. But coming back to the metaverse, I do think that there is a component where actually I just don't know. I think mostly the association between Web3 and the metaverse is a marketing thing by Facebook, who's desperate to make a story.
So let me ask a different question. Tim, there is a side of Web3 and what blockchain enables that a lot of people describe as sort of a user-owned internet, and I really want to take that approach and just use you to kind of try and unpack that and break that down. What does that actually mean, a user-owned internet?
I don't buy it at all. Okay, and I don't buy it for 2 or 3 reasons. First one is I believe that the original idealistic vision of some of the Web3 work was very much that, yes, it would return power to the users. In reality, the whole crypto Web3 ecosystem is the most rapidly consolidating ecosystem of any I've seen. It took, there were 10 years before the web came out and before the real concentration of power began. The whole, obviously, if you go all the way back to beginning of Bitcoin, yeah, it was a while, but very rapidly you saw this consolidation of ownership in small number of hands. And so there's very little evidence that it was really a reset. It was just like, okay, we want to have this, we're just going to rebuild the system just with different people at the top of the pyramid. But more importantly, my long-term history of the computer industry is summed up very accurately by Clay Christensen's law of conservation of attractive profits. That is, something becomes a commodity, something else becomes valuable. I mean, Clay and I had a mind meld about this, back when I was working on open source, and I'd been talking about this, because when I entered the industry, IBM was the big bad monopolist, and they had this lock on computer hardware. Then the PC, which was made out of commodity parts, turned computer hardware into a commodity. And it took a few years before it became clear that Microsoft had figured out that, in this world where hardware was a commodity, the operating system was the source of lock-in. So, and then, some decade and a half later, along comes the internet and open source, and they're challenging Microsoft. And again, caught in the wrong metaphor. The original enthusiasm about Linux was, it'll be the new Windows, right? We're gonna do this, play the old game, but we're gonna win, and we'll have these new ideals. And I was like, no, that's not how it works. What's happening is that the open source software and the open protocols of the internet are going to commoditize the opportunity for software, and something else is going to become valuable. And that's when I started theorizing that big data was going to be the new source of lock-in, right? So that was a big part of my Web 2. So, okay, so here we are, where the way that Google and Amazon and Facebook are so dominant is through control over data. And we still have fundamentally decentralized protocols underlying the internet, TCP/IP, HTTP. They're totally decentralized, but that doesn't matter, right? So why would introducing a new decentralized protocol in a world where decentralized protocols exist change the game? I think what's going to change the game in that arc of this periodic cycle of centralization and decentralization is something that decentralizes the power of data. And I actually think that we've already seen the beginnings of that in these large language models. And I think in some ways, the development of large language models is kind of analogous to the way that IBM didn't understand what they were setting loose when they decided to make a personal computer out of commodity parts with a standardized architecture. Because when you have a large language model that, for example, just understands human language, you can, let me just actually back up a little bit and talk a little bit about how I came to this at O'Reilly Media. We started working with a small company called Miso, which basically helped build us an improved search experience on the O'Reilly platform, which can, the O'Reilly online platform is tens of thousands of online books, tens of thousands of hours of online video, live training, sandboxes where people can try out different technologies, sold to corporation. And, search, we were using old-fashioned search technology, Solr, open source search engine. And it was always like whack-a-mole, trying to get the search to work properly. You need a big team. And then along comes this team, says, we can help you with machine learning-based search. And so they took BERT, which is one of the first large language models that releases open source. And it basically does natural language understanding. And then they trained it on our content. And suddenly we can ask plain language questions of our entire corpus, which is not just books from O'Reilly, but from dozens of other publishers, thousands and thousands of books. And you go right to the page or right to the minute of the video because you suddenly have this machine that understands this body of content. And it's interesting because as the language models have gotten bigger and bigger, and you see things like GPT-3 and equivalents, in some ways they're actually getting more amazing in terms of some of the ways that they seem to work. They seem to be able to converse with you. I mean, some of the new ones at Google in particular, I've just been really blown away by how conversational they are. But they've actually ingested all the crap of the internet, whereas BERT just ingested enough to be able to understand human language, and then you can train it. And I thought, oh, that's kind of how humans work. We don't learn everything. We don't kind of go, well, the way that you're going to train a human is they're going to learn everything from plumbing to nuclear physics, and they'll know the answer to everything. People get to a certain level of competency, and then they specialize. And so that's really what's happening now with I think machine learning, and it's not to say that there won't be a re-centralization, because there always is. But right now there's this amazing opportunity. This company Miso is not just working with us; they're working with a bunch of e-commerce companies. So they're training the AI model on somebody's content. And suddenly, any company, any small company, can do search of their stuff better than Google can. And at the same time, you have this problem with Google, which is that at request to keep their profits up. This is kind of like where it goes to the work I'm doing at UCL. I think a lot about the role of the big aggregators like Google and Amazon was this great advance in the coordination of markets, where effectively Google and Amazon were running an invisible hand, so to speak. And unlike, and algorithmically, they were doing a really good job of taking more factors into account. And Google was especially interesting. You think about how Google search originally was, didn't use price at all as a factor. Amazon still took price as one of the factors, but traditionally, price coordination, what's the willing buyer and willing seller willing to transact as, sort of thought in some ways as the coordinating function of the invisible hand. And here was this marketplace connecting, billions of searches with, hundreds of millions of information providers in real time without taking pricing into account at all. So immense advance in market coordination. And then there was a parallel market of advertising with pay-per-click. And again, even there, they were using signals like, well, how likely were people to actually click on an ad? You didn't sell the ad to the highest bidder, you sold the ad to the most profitable bidder based on the likelihood of clicking. So this was all this harnessing collective intelligence stuff I talked about in Web 2.0. But roll forward 10 years. Well, first of all, so here's this period of intense innovation. And this is what happens in new markets. And there's this concept in economics of Schumpeterian rents. Joseph Schumpeter kind of talked about. So basically, rent in economics is different, is defined as profits in excess of normal, supernormal profits. And you can kind of see this in the as companies like Google and Amazon and Meta emerge, they get this dominance because they're just better than everybody else, right? But the idea is eventually these rents get competed away, right? But anyway, I call this period of rents driven by innovation, where you're just better than the rest of the market, so you do better and you keep that up. I call those rising tide rents. It's just it's a broad term. And then there's this other kind of rent that gets talked about a lot, which are what I call, in the general category, I call them robber baron rents. Kind of goes back to the early days when economic theorists were talking about rent. It was literally, here's this yeoman farmer producing grain, and along comes the baron's men. They say, we'll take your grain, we'll take half your grain this year. And they didn't actually do anything productive. They just kind of were takers. And you see that today in an industry like pharma. Patents are government granted, rent. And you see, when the patents expire and you see the difference in price between an expensive drug and then the cheap generic, you go, oh, all that was rent, right? And I call those robber baron rents because they're gathered through an excess of power. I have the power to take it, whether it's by law or just market power. So what I see happening right now in the internet, we're at this inflection point over the last 5 or 6 years, where the big internet companies have shifted from rising tide rents, where they were getting outsized profits because they were being innovative, to, oh, we have to keep growing. The market demands that we keep growing our profits, and they start doing things that are more abusive. So surveillance capitalism, the fact that you see on both Google and Amazon, where they originally used to take all of this time and energy to show you what the universe of their users thought was the best product. And now they're increasingly driving traffic to themselves or to their advertisers. So Amazon is really blatant. On a typical search on Amazon, say 20 positions that are available on the screen, and that's even with scrolling, only 4 of them are now organic results. All the rest are ads or Amazon products.
In a way, they almost like moved from, and I want to connect that back to why there is so many proponents on the Web3 front, but in a way they moved from being minimally extractive to maximally extractive of the platform that they've built.
And this is why I think that this idea with if you add the things like with what we're doing with large language models, to companies like Shopify, which are really trying to do this decentralized, and suddenly you go, wow, we can actually search our content really effectively, better than Google can. So it's better to come search an individual company's site than it is to search on Google, because Google's no longer sending traffic to other people except through advertising, right? Which is very expensive. Amazon's no longer sending traffic except to their advertisers. So that whole space is now open again. But I guess here's the thing that I see. I see that as a problem that has to be solved on the data level, not on the protocol level, and not, it's certainly possible that you could do a reset in the way that, say, the web did a reset, where it just kind of created this new space where people could be, kind of fresh and honest again. But I just don't see it as needed. I think what we really need is a revolution on the data layer, which is a lot about the findability. And so when I think about Web3, I do think there are, real possibilities in the financial space. I think.
I'm sorry. That's something that I actually wanted to drill into, if you don't mind. And I know you're a VC as well, and
yeah,
obviously walled gardens extract economic rent. It's very good for investors, whether you're in the VC stage or public equities. Investors like economic rent. It's very good for returns. And so it may not be a dichotomy based on the way you're describing it as having the next thing that commoditizes the current walled gardens and the rent extractors. But how do you kind of marry that together with this, egalitarian view of, we want to break down the current walled gardens and free up some of the excess profit they're taking, versus I need to make returns for my investors and my funds?
Yeah. I think that's probably the biggest argument against Web3 being, as it's currently conceived, being meaningful, is that the money arrived too soon. So basically the goal of every Web3 company is rent extraction, right? And so that's completely at odds with, because they're all VC fueled. And, if you contrast that with, the early days of the personal computer or the early days of the web, the personal computer was like, whoa, this is so cool. You can have your own computer. This is just like, it was totally enthusiast driven. The web, Microsoft seemed to have everything all sewn up. So it was just totally enthusiast driven. I mean, Larry and Sergey didn't start, Google because they thought they could make a fortune, and they didn't raise very much money. So I think the total raised by Google was $35 million. And so in the last decade, I think it's really very, very difficult for something truly revolutionary and, level setting, resetting of the level of innovation to happen, because there's been so much capital chasing outsized returns and economic rents. So I don't think we will see Web3 when the bubble bursts and all those people are out of work and they start building stuff just for the hell of it. Then we'll start to figure out whether there's some there.
Maybe we should stop calling it Web3 right now and call it Web A16Z, because that's kind of where it's all going
I think that's actually that's actually really right. It is the venture capitalists, wet dream, as is a lot of the rhetoric about the metaverse. I think there's something really happening underneath, and we need to keep looking for it. But when you see somebody making, having great valuations without actually making money, that's the other thing. Again, I go back to, Amazon seemed to be an exception in the sense that they were losing money, but Jeff had realized that cash flow was more meaningful than profit. Because of the dynamics of the internet, he was collecting money faster than he was spending it, and so as long as he keep growing, he actually had a perpetual motion machine, which turned out. Whereas most of the current generation, the cash was coming in, the cash wasn't coming in from customers, it was coming in from VCs. And that's just a Ponzi scheme. And so we've been living in the Ponzi tech economy for the last decade. And, and not to say that there aren't some companies, it's like, Airbnb was making real money from customers. Uber, not so much.
There are definitely a few companies that I think Roblox actually is one of them that have been generating cash flow for a very long time. Airbnb is one, but these are the exception to the rule. The other piece, Tim, that I think is really important to articulate for our audience is that, in a way, what's happening now, it's like the crush came after something was already coined Web3. We're still in the TBD, what is that crash versus the Web 2.0 that you popularized, right? That came after the crash. And so, I am personally very curious, as also as someone, as a builder in the wider space of the metaverse, to see how that plays out. But to me, the important piece is that what happens next? Are we going to still see greed fueling initiatives and ventures built in, Web3, or are there going to be truly genuine, authentic projects that are trying to, what you kind of mentioned, to find, is there something real? Is there something true that is actually driving a better internet that makes sense, or not? And does it need a whole new decentralized infrastructure and protocols? Or do we just need to focus on fixing, Web 2.0? And then, we want to call it Web 3, great. Or we just call it Web 2.1. It doesn't really matter, what the term is. What matters, are we creating an internet where we are going to more effectively, sustainably, and scalably enable many more people, what I think of as stakeholder capitalism, to enjoy the wealth creation and the evolution of platforms?
I think that's right. And I do think that if I were to say there is a counterforce to the big Web 2 centralization, it's way more apparent in things that would have been just thought of as continuations of the current model than some radical break. Shopify, for example, has done more to decentralize Amazon. I think this little company Miso is doing more to decentralize Amazon than Web3 projects. And despite and I don't see anybody in Web3 who's really saying, well, we have anything to do with what Google does, right? It's sort of like, where's the, because there was this sort of rhetoric about it, but come on, I mean, where is this vast upwelling of some Web3 or Metaverse type properties that, would enable a search engine, that would need a search engine? I mean, again, when the original web took off, it really was new real estate. People were going, oh, wow, you mean I can actually have my own presence on the internet? And over, you watched it just stair step up from, when we first published the whole Internet Users Guide in 1993, there were 200 websites. And, when we started GNN, which was the first web portal, we listed a few thousand, and then Yahoo came along and listed, it was tens of thousands. And then, by 98, which was, 5 years later, you needed a search engine, right? There were so many, and eventually, Google, announced in, a few years after, there were 1 trillion web pages, so I don't really see any equivalent in Web3 to that. I do think that there is some potential in, kind of routing around the big financial players. But again, I don't know enough about it, but I do think that to build a new alternate financial system is really, really, really hard. And it might happen, but it's not going to happen in the time frames of the current VCs, because I often actually when the crypto investment craze first came along, I just looked at it, I said, this looks to me as if the dot-com boom had happened in the 80s instead of the 90s, right? It happened in the early 80s instead of the early 90s, right? Because the technology just wasn't there. You had all these primitive network internet things happening in the 80s, and it was cool. All the protocols were there, everything was there, but there was no money, right? So, but here it's as if billions of dollars were flowing in to the world of FTP and Telnet.
That would have been hilarious.
Yeah, exactly. And nobody thought. And so, I guess when I think about it as an investor, there may be something here, but my money on the next wave of great fortunes, I think, are going to be in energy and space. And the fact that Elon Musk is the world's richest person is, is a good sign of that in some sense, because first of all, once you have, one person who becomes super rich, with a startup that's sort of related to energy and climate and then actually space as well, you go, other people are going to be jumping into that market as well. And all of a sudden capital is going to start flowing. There already are thousands of space companies. There are thousands of, and there are actually quite a few climate billionaires, people making solar panels in China. But there's so much real work to be done there. And, I only wish that all the money that was chasing Web3 had been chasing real investment in the energy infrastructure that we're going to need to deal with climate. And Elon Musk is the only person who's done that. And that really goes to my, Bill Janeway talks about productive bubbles, and great example of Tesla stock is a great example of a productive bubble. The stock was sky high, falls in half, doesn't really matter because Elon took that money or some of that money and he built the gigafactory. He funded, SpaceX and Starlink. And so there's all this shit that's real stuff. Whereas if you have this big bubble in crypto and it went to buy a bunch of NFTs of Bored Apes, and the air goes out of the bubble, you're left with a bunch of images. That's an unproductive bubble. So I wish that some of that crypto money that came out of that bubble had gone, and some of it has. I mean, Jed McCaleb, for example, who was the CTO at Stellar and so on, became a crypto billionaire, is investing in space. He's investing in fundamental research and science. And I think there's going to be breakthroughs in synthetic biology, for example. So some of that has happened. And actually, I think, again, when when the bubble really pops, and we're just in the beginning of that, popping process, I think, you're going to see who's left standing. And I think it's going to be the people who figured out how to take that bubble wealth and turn it into productive wealth.
Maybe one last question. It's running short on time before we wrap up. I know it's something you've also focused on. It's, the policy side of this and how governments need to be involved in everything. I think with the internet as it is today, we're trying to put speed limits on the Autobahn at this point. We let it run free, kind of using regulations that were written in 1934, right? That was the Communications Act. And, basically kind of tried to regulate the internet with rules that were made for, landline phones. And so how do you think about governments needing to proactively, put a framework around the next iteration of the internet to help facilitate what we're talking about in kind of breaking down some of the walled gardens?
It's a little bit hard to say. I do think that, again, if you read a book like Tim Wu's The Master Switch, you kind of see a recurrent pattern where the future begins with enthusiasts, whether it's sort of like radio or FM radio was a second wave, television, movies. He kind of goes through all of these things, electrification, and the internet was just the latest stage of, this wildcat era of innovation that was let run free, and then started to be reined in after it had grown and consolidated. So I do think that premature regulation is a bad idea. But so is regulation coming too late. And so the real question is, could you find the sweet spot in between? Maybe. I do think that my own approach and the focus of most of my writing and research on antitrust is look, big companies, here's this recurring pattern. Here's what's going to happen to you if you continue down this path. Regulate yourselves, for Christ's sake. Look at Microsoft. There was this great quote once from Walt Mossberg said to me. He repeated to me a conversation that he claimed he had with Steve Ballmer when Ballmer was the CEO of Microsoft. And he said, Steve, if you would just dial back the greed, only 5%, your problems would go away. You know, and it really isn't that much for companies to go, wait a minute. You know, and so a lot of what I've focused on in these big, you know, I love the European term from the Digital Markets Act, where they call them gatekeepers, these big gatekeeper firms, you know, like Google and Amazon, to go, oh, wait, we have to actually look after our ecosystem. You know, so here's Google that used to send traffic to websites, and now they send traffic to themselves. Can't they see where that is going to end up? You know, if they're starving all you know, at some point there's only Google left as an information resource. That's not going to happen.
Maybe
business first.
Maybe someone should send an email to Andy Jassy and to the CEO of Google and say, maybe just dial your greed just 5% down.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think there is that, you know, and I think you see little bits of signs of that, you know, where Amazon, in their rhetoric at least, is saying, well, we're really trying to enable and help small businesses. And I do think that there's some truth to that in their marketplace. But, you know, again, I think some good criticism of them, which I do think they pay attention to, that says, hey, look, we're looking over your shoulder. We're seeing how little traffic you're sending, how basically most of the traffic you're sending to those marketplace players now is paid for. That's an additional tax. And again, that's why I think I have a research agenda around that, because for me, again, one of the issues with regulation is regulators have a real hard time because these things become immense black boxes. And so one of the things that you could do earlier is ask for more disclosure. You know, so I think, and that's probably the best thing we can do now, and for any future technology, is to have less secrecy. You know, and we see this like with Elon Musk and Twitter. Okay, how many bot and fake accounts are there at Twitter? Why is that not in their 10K? Why is that not in Facebook's 10K? You know, that's material to investors. So there's an idea that we have these regulatory systems like, you know, they're supposed to be material. And that was the source of a paper that I wrote recently with Elon Strauss and Mariana Mazzucato. Elon was the principal author, but you know, about something called segment reporting, where, you know, companies above a certain size are supposed to break out their business segments. Well, these companies are so darn big that, you know, the way the rules were written, you know, you go, okay, well, it has to be more than, you know, 10% of your business. Well, 10% of Apple's business is a Fortune, you know, 50 company, you know? I mean, you know, so basically they can go and not report anything.
Well, these are rules that were written when corporate America, even the largest companies, couldn't even dream about the possibility of becoming a $1 trillion, you know, market cap company. But, you know, I wanna conclude. We can go on and on. This is such a phenomenal conversation, and we went so far beyond the metaverse. We went from the metaverse to space, back to Earth. Getting a lesson in history from Tim. This has been such a phenomenal episode, Tim. I think it's going to blow people's mind to listen, and I think there's so many things that we can follow up on with future episodes as well. We cannot wait to share this episode. If you like the episode and the podcast, you know, check out all of our links. We're going to publish this with potentially other links that Tim mentioned. Tim, thank you again for coming in. We talked about so many things. It's been phenomenal. Really appreciate the wisdom, the history, and all of the lessons today.
All right. Thank you very much for having me.